Hey, kia ora koutou whānau. Welcome back to another edition of Big Hairy News with me, Pat Britton. And as we heard last night, Chewy is off doing celebrity things at the Dunedin Fringe Festival tonight. He's going to be doing a few things with the festival over the next week or so. He'll be here every now and again, backwards and forwards, but that is where he is at tonight. So you've got me. But brilliantly, we've got a couple of interviews set up with a couple of guests, so there is a lot of content to check out for tonight. Firstly and foremostly, I hope everyone has now caught up with Ted Lasso, the first episode of Ted Lasso. I watched it this afternoon, and whilst there's no spoilers coming, I'm sure once Chewy comes back, we'll be delving into it. So if you haven't watched it yet, you have been warned. You have been warned. We will be having a look at that. Speaking of having a look at, tonight, Silicon Valley Bank has collapsed. Yeah, there's some other banks in the US that have collapsed as well. We've got coming on board a conversation that I've already had. If you're a patron, you'll have possibly already seen the conversation with Darcy Ungaro. Darcy has been with us a couple of times. He's a financial advisor. He works in the world of banking and mortgages, and he runs a very successful business podcast. He's going to join us, and we're going to talk about the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank, what it means, if anything. A little bit later on this hour, we're going to be talking about the term woke. What is woke? What does it mean to be woke? And I know we've had this conversation a little bit before, but there's been a few things happening around the internet in the last couple of days, kind of adding fuel to the fire of people using talking points and not really understanding what the words mean themselves. So we'll have a look at that towards the end of the hour. And we're going to start the show talking, well, we're going to talk about Gary Lineker. Now, that may not mean that much to you as a New Zealander. Gary Lineker is a former football player, football star in the UK about 25 years ago, played for the national team, very successful, very good, very beloved in America, in the UK, then became a pundit and a commentator and is on one of the biggest football shows in the world, Match of the Day. Gary Lineker made some tweets. Those tweets caused some controversy at the BBC, and we're going to talk a bit about what has happened there and what that means tonight. Now, what I said, that the issue of Gary Lineker may not impact you too much, but there's an interesting through line here of conversation talking about public broadcasters and how they handle social media. So I've got an expert coming on to talk about that who's written for the conversation. Marek Bekerman is going to come on and join us very, very shortly to have a chat about that. So it could also be said about commercial radio, commercial TV as well, and how the quote unquote stars, the personalities on those places, interact on social media and how that represents the company they're on. Tonight, we're going to mostly be talking about public broadcasting, but it's a new age we're living in, and media entities, great and small, need to figure out how to do this. So we'll be having a bit of a look at that in just a minute. Before we do that, let's say a big thanks to our patrons. Thank you for coming on board. Good to have you guys on board. Rob and Alex and Kookie and the name's jumping out of my head at the moment, but who won the book last week. A bunch of your stuff went into the post today for being on the Patreon platforms and levels that you are on. Thank you for being on board. Thank you for being a part of what we do. If you are interested in supporting the work we do, it's very simple. Come and join the team. Help us to make independent news by heading to patreon.com/Big Hairy News. Big Hairy News. That's what we are all about. Right. So that's the show in a nutshell. If you want to comment, or if you want to share your thoughts on any of these, the conversation with Darcy is a pre-record. So that's already happened. So you'll be able to watch that. You won't be able to comment on it. The conversation I'm about to have next is live all the way from Poland, actually. It's live all the way from Poland. And the conversation at the end of the night is just a little bit of you and me chin wagging. So you can come on board and we can chat about all being woke together when we do that. So to start the show off tonight, we want to welcome to the show the program leader for the master's students. So in the master's international journalism course, a lecturer in radio and international journalism from the University of Salford, currently watching his son at a fencing competition, I believe, in Poland. It's Marek Bekerman. Marek, thanks so much for joining us. We really appreciate you giving us some time.
I'm happy to be with you.
Before we get into the conversation, I just have to say, anytime I think about the University of Salford, I think about this clip from 8 out of 10 Cats. I'm going to play it. It's got nothing to do with our story, but it's hilarious watching Jimmy Carr say Salford incorrectly.
Jason has a media and performance degree from the University of Salford, and yet despite that,
Stop,
he's
Jimmy.
What?
Salford. We've said this before.
What did he say?
He said Salford.
What's spelled S-A-L-F-O-R-D?
That way, but it's said.
Did you say salt?
Salford.
No, salt.
There you go.
Okay, Jason has a media and performance degree from the University of Salford, and yet despite that, he's done really well for himself.
So there you go. That'll get us kicked off YouTube. So if you're watching us in the live stream, you've got to see it. Probably the people who are watching us on demand won't, because we'll get kicked off the internet for playing that. But I wanted to play it at Marek because that's my association with the University of Salford. So thank you for doing it.
Ironically, I am constantly censured for saying Salford by the locals. So I don't know.
The locals call it Salford in your experience.
Yes, they do.
Oh, well, there you go. There you go. There you go. Hey, look, thank you for joining us. As I said earlier, you're in Poland at the moment. You're teaching in the UK, though. I
Yes.
caught up with some of your writings on The Conversation. Now, we have a conversation in New Zealand. This is not the New Zealand version of it. I was doing some looking around for the Gary Lineker story. And your article came up talking about the BBC and how they're struggling to adapt to the social media age. Obviously, BBC, biggest public broadcaster in the world, I believe, and obviously social media. It is a brand new world, and these public entities are needing to come across how to deal with that, especially with their personalities. So why don't you just kick us off by maybe expanding on your title, expanding on your story, and explain maybe why and how, and for people to know, you worked for the BBC for like 20 years.
Yes, that's right. Yes.
Yeah. So you know it from the inside out, and now you're working as an academic and a lecturer in this world as well.
Yes. So
What's going on?
perhaps-
What's going on at the BBC around social media and their personalities?
Okay, I wish I knew, because I'm no longer an insider, and having been there for more than 2 decades gives me a limited mandate to talk about it. With reference to the title, that's not my title. Obviously, it went through the editing process and got more tamed in its formulation. So I wouldn't say that the BBC struggles with social media. It's got its own specific take on how social media combines with its mission and activities. And I think we should also give credit to the BBC for a few things. They were really one of the first broadcasters to embrace the world of the internet with reference to news.
Yep.
So with virtually no budget, they developed bbcnews.com and became the most visited news website. So there was a lot of kind of a visionary foresight on the part of people who were in the know rather than the BBC managers. Unfortunately, the BBC is run by the managers, and they often make some kinds of mistakes. With reference to social media, they have pretty advanced and informed approach to new media and their core legacy activities. But in this case, I think we're dealing with a combination of a couple of factors. One, which I would call the class system within the BBC itself in reference to its staff and contributors. And the second is the residual belief that the BBC is still the dog and not the tail. And unfortunately, I think the reality, particularly with the younger generation, is that it's the other way around. Young people know about the BBC from their news feeds and streams rather than from direct consumption of the BBC as a broadcaster. A lot of my students do not consume any scheduled or linear broadcasts. They don't even know what the mission, the philosophy and the ethos of the BBC is. If they do, they know it indirectly, secondhand. The same goes for the news. So they don't even identify the original sources being the BBC. It's simply slightly amorphous news item or talking point knocking about on social media. So I think the BBC still thinks that is important in the same way as it was 2 decades ago. It's not the case. It's should see itself more as an influencer in a big way.
Right.
And even though it's got a mandate, a charter, we're dealing with the situations which has been described by the Conservative Party Deputy Chairman, Lee Anderson, only a couple of days ago. Lineker has become bigger than the BBC. And I think it encapsulates the situation where a single person or personality basically acts and performs the role of a micro or mini media organization. And that created this quite significant problem, which may seem trivial from the distance, but actually is key to the more important question about how you shape public opinion and conduct public discourse on social media.
Yeah, as you describe it as a micro media entity, I think in your article you talk about how someone on a social media platform can have a massive audience. So there are some singular individual people that have far bigger audiences, some entire media entities. And I'm intrigued by you describing them or suggesting that they should treat themselves like an influencer. That word has such, I think, negative connotations to quote unquote serious news people. Influencers seem to be frivolous and something on Instagram that sells, products to help beauty products and that kind of stuff. But I guess what I hear you saying is the influencer, the thing that an influencer does is influence, and that's what the news can do, and maybe change the way they're thinking about what they're doing. I'm not saying not being hard news, because I don't like infotainment, when it comes to news and stuff myself. It's important that we have factual, unbiased news as well. But to maybe deliver it in a different way, deliver it more like an influencer would, not necessarily in like your leggings and having your butt out, but in a style that they would with as a way that the younger generation, the next generation, will receive it better. Is that sort of what you're saying about consider themselves to be influencers?
I think that when divorced from the internet and social media environment, the word influence is totally positive or has got the right meaning. It's often that you, against the context of the virtual world, words and terms and definitions change. And here we talk about influencing. It's shaping the public opinion. If you say the BBC shapes the public opinion, everybody's so happy about it. That's what it should do. Do it with a certain ethos and values and standards of impartiality, accuracy, and all that stuff. But when you embed it into the internet environment, it suddenly becomes a negative thing. And this is the thing that a lot of things, when they receive an iteration or formulation within the virtual world, they are disfigured, distorted, and almost become a caricature of things. So we have a situation when a football pundit, because essentially speaking, Gary Lineker is a football pundit. When he makes an utterance of a political nature, it reverberates in a completely disproportional way, purely because he's got millions of followers who have who follow his Twitter account. And although he's got a limited knowledge and is very badly informed politically, although there is a caveat to it, he is communicating with millions of people who are sport fans and supporters or football supporters, and their exposure to news is very limited. It's very often through the prism of football. So how can they relate to public discourse in politics and culture? They do it through the prism and in the context of sport, which can be really quite harmful. And this is what happened. What is interesting is that few people have actually bothered to analyze how and what Lineker said in his tweet. And you know,
which I think we should do, Marek. So why don't we put it up? This is from your the conversation piece. This is what Gary Lineker said. There is no huge influx. This is talking about migrants coming to the UK, and I think they call it the small boat policy or something like that. I think as well, actually, and I'm not sure if this is in your article. Correct me if I'm wrong, but the UN has actually criticised this policy as well. But so this is what Gary Lineker did. There's no huge influx. We take far fewer refugees in other major European countries. This is just an immense, cruel policy directed at the most vulnerable people in language that is not dissimilar to that used by Germany in the 30s. And I'm out of order? ? Now, the media in the UK then took the reference to Germany in the 30s, and their headlines were Gary Lineker's Nazi tweet. Which, you know, I can see why they'd draw that parallel, but it's not exactly what he said, talking about Germany in the 30s. So that's the context of what he said. You're saying people aren't like delving into the information that he's also putting out there. What else do we need to know?
Well, I think there are a few things. Who jumped on that tweet was not exactly, I think, originally the BBC. It was the Conservatives, which saw this as completely out of order, because if you kind of read the paraphrastic or oblique formulation by Lineker, not using the offensive words like Nazi or Hitler or anything like that, and what he does, I think that he has been quite disingenuous the way he wrote the tweet, which may seem innocent, but it bypasses the words which usually trigger filtering of such tweets and comments online. Sometimes it's referred to as the Godwin law, which is a way of dealing with offensive content referring to Nazi, Holocaust, and things like that, which pretty much trivializes any debate when you try to roll out that type of criticism against your opponents. So he bypassed that. So he's not as innocent as it may seem, because the formulation is not dissimilar to that of Germany in the 30s, obviously avoids using those words or association which an algorithm would identify as offensive or insulting. It was a highly political statement. It was targeted at a specific policy, which was a government policy. So strictly speaking, it is definitely not impartial. Now, the question is that as a football pundit, is he free to make political comments within the framework of his contract? And it looks like there were precedents when he escaped scot-free in the past, like last year in September, he said something not exactly similar, but the BBC actually supported him against its own staff, who pointed out, look, Lineker is kind of trespassing on his brief as a football pundit. So we must be aware of the fact that it is a transgression. Now the question is, does it somehow impinge on the freedom of speech? Because, as rightly pointed out, a lot of these people who are so-called freelancers or contributors with the BBC have their own interest and life outside the BBC, and you can't require everybody, a musician, a scientist, whatever, to abide by all the standards and editorial guidelines in their lives and public appearances, statements outside the BBC context.
Yeah,
so it's a difficult one.
Is it though? I mean, it seems to me that if you're doing news, if you're in the BBC news department, if you're a journalist, you've probably got those clauses in your contract. If you're anybody else, it's not necessarily as important. I want to play a piece of audio here as well. This is from Sky Sport. The commentator is Kavi Solkol, and one of the points he makes in this commentary as well is he talks about what happens at the BBC, what has happened with other people, up to and including management and very highly rated, very highly ranked management, and their conflicts of interest that never get questioned, other personalities whose statements never get questioned, yet they've pulled out Gary Lineker. Maybe they needed to have a poster child to stop all this happening. But listen to the point that, this is for my people, I'm sure you've heard this, Marek, but listen to the point that this commentator makes about how the BBC's inconsistency seems to be one of the problems here.
How come somebody like Andrew Neil, who for a very, very long time was the BBC's top political broadcaster and interviewer, how come it was okay for him to be the chairman of a right-wing magazine, The Spectator? How come it was okay for him to go on social media and Twitter and display his political opinions on a whole range of matters? How come it's okay for the chairman of the BBC, Richard Sharp, to be somebody who donated £400,000 to the Conservative Party and then went on to play a role in arranging an £800,000 loan for Boris Johnson? Why is it okay for Robbie Gibb, or as we're supposed to call him, Sir Robbie Gibb, to be on the BBC board when he was a director of communications for the former Prime Minister, Theresa May? Why is it okay for Alan Sugar, another high-profile figure on the BBC, to say what he thinks about political matters on Twitter? Why is it okay for Tim Davie, who's the Director General of the BBC, the Director General? He used to be the Deputy Chairman of the Hammersmith and Fulham Conservative Party. He stood in local elections as a Conservative candidate. How come Jeremy Clarkson, who used to be on the BBC, why was he allowed to have a column in The Sun and the Sunday Times, and on social media frequently made political comments which a lot of people thought were extreme? This is what people are thinking. Why have all these people been allowed to effectively do and say what they want, but Gary Lineker is not allowed to make a comment about a government policy which has been condemned by the United Nations and many human rights groups?
There you go. So there's the question of consistency, I guess, as well, Marek. So what is your response to the point being made?
Well,
by
here
the
we
pundit
enter the murky world of BBC boardrooms and the issues of class and establishment. And all these people listed by the presenter reflect the stratification in terms of what they can do or what they can't. I mean, just to give you a very trivial example, as BBC staff, I started to write for an outside publication that was spotted by my line manager, who immediately approached me and reproached me, while I said, look, my other colleagues are writing for a plethora of other outside publications and broadcasters, and they don't seem to have a problem. Yes, but it's complicated, Marek. You have to approach us and get clearance for that. So everybody got very different treatments. It all depended on the pecking order and their position in the food chain. So the top people have much more leeway and a much wider range of freedom. But having said that, it's also a question of responsibility. A person like Andrew Neil knows how to behave within his role with the BBC, and so he will not push or promote his points of view or positions when he acts in a different capacity. So these are all these nuances which are sometimes difficult to capture in terms of contractual obligations and proper behavior or due diligence. I think it's all down in the devil is in the detail, and we have no insight into the, formulation and wording of the contracts. And I think the BBC as an arbiter here appears to be arbitrary. They refer to the contracts. The issue with Lineker is probably that he started being more and more active politically, and it raised eyebrows. And I think that there was a knee-jerk reaction on the part of the BBC when they were attacked by the Conservatives. So they acted impetuously rather than talking to Lineker first, say, look, we raised you from a baby to a highest paying commentator, because when he came to comment to do commentary, he wasn't great, and the BBC has got this unspoken or unarticulated proviso that we can make anyone into a star. And I've seen that, the so-called accelerated career paths, with somebody who's been anointed to be a star is given a lot of training and investment to perform very well on air and to become a public figure and a celebrity. So they did invest in him a lot of money and made him into a great commentator. He's their baby, he's their product.
Yeah.
So
it's
he
really
should
interesting.
behave, and because he had outgrown his initial kind of persona, he started to go into politics. Even some people even were saying that he's become a spokesman for the Labour Party. And I think it's a question of not what is written and it's the gentleman's agreement. And I think that essentially it's about the fact that he has transgressed that kind of gentleman's agreement, and he started to act against the best interests of the BBC, who genuinely tried to do a very hard balancing act in their precarious position given the funding issues, the changing media environment, digitization, and all that.
Well, look, I think the other thing is, in the end, I think Gary Lineker wins. I think it was summed up beautifully by author Nick Pettigrew. I don't know if you've seen this, Marek, but on Twitter, this is the tweet that Nick Pettigrew, who's a British author, sent out. He says those BBC negotiations in full. Delete the tweets. No. Okay, we'll apologize for them. No. Well, we'll get somebody else to do your job if you don't. And something we haven't talked about is no other presenter would take the job, would step up. So in other words, no one would back the BBC, none of the other presenters. So the response is everyone down stools. Will you promise not to tweet political stuff in the future? No. Okay, we have a deal. And that's kind of the result as to how it's come out. And it's fascinating for me to look at our own public entities here and see how they handle it. TVNZ is a separate entity in New Zealand to RNZ, and they kind of handle the social media world differently. But, this has been, I think, if nothing else, a conversation starter for social media, public media entities, and maybe on some other level, news entities as well. If you're a journalist working at a commercial news entity, like you might want to have some similar rules in place about impartiality. But, Gary Lineker is not in the news world. He's in the football world. He's a pundit. He's not employed by the BBC. I think the BBC went a bit too far here, Mark.
Yes, I agree. And the tweet which you showed, I think it's pretty much what probably happened. But there is some doubt about the last question. Will you not do political stuff in there? He may have said, I'll think about it rather than no. But that's true. The hand of the BBC doesn't extend as far as they wish it would. And that's a very good example. They no longer have the range of influence and say in how public opinion is shaped.
Yeah.
And I think they need to think about their position in the new world and how to ascertain or secure it properly in the new environment. And I think if they still think in terms of those, rigid rules and regulations which could be enforced in the traditional world of media, but you really would need a very new and entirely different framework of operating as a public broadcaster in that environment. And I think that needs to be looked at seriously and creatively.
Yeah, I think that's true, because social media is not going anywhere and people's opinions aren't going anywhere, Mark. But look, thank you so much for joining us this evening, New Zealand time, morning, Polish time. Marek Beckerman from the University of Salford. We'll go with Salford. Salford.
There you go.
Excellent. Thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
It's in Manchester anyway.
It is in Manchester. Very good. All the best.
Take care. Bye.
So there you go. Tons of commentary has been coming in about this as we've been talking about it, as along with other things as well. Oh, this is actually about banks and other things as well. Oh, there's one there. Free Soul says, as a former public broadcaster person, I'm disappointed with the Beeb on this. Public radio is supposed to be impartial. Very good. All right, listen, we're going to roll straight into our next conversation. And our next conversation is with a guest. He has been with us before. His name is Darcy Ungaro. He is going to be talking to us about the collapse of SVB, the Silicon Valley Bank. Yep, and this is a conversation that's pre-recorded. If you want to make comment on it, you're more than welcome to make comment on it. We'll bring it up at the end. And then to wrap up the show tonight, we're going to talk about what it means to be woke. What it means to be woke, New Zealand. Here's Darcy Ungaro and I from earlier this afternoon. All right, and we welcome to the show Darcy Ungaro. Darcy Ungaro, best known to us people who hover around the dark recesses of the internet as the host of the Everyday Investor, NZ Everyday Investor, a podcast. NZ Everyday Investor podcast is New Zealand's top-rating, award-winning series that explores everything around building wealth. The mission is to help everyday Kiwis build new wealth using old and new tools. Darcy, welcome to the show.
Yes.
Long time.
Hey,
long time no see.
Thank you for having me.
Really, really good, man. Listen, I've been mulling over this SVB bank thing for a few days. I've been doing some readings and some watchings, and I think I'm kind of have a handle on it. But as we always do here in BHN, we like being the dumbest people in the room. And so we get on people who run in this world to maybe have a chat with us about SVB to start off with. So why don't I just throw the ball to you? Should I throw the ball to you, or should I play a bit of a clip first?
Why don't you play a clip? Go for it. Let's ease our way into it.
All right. So let's have a bit of a look at what happened with SVB Bank. This is a little clip talking about, what is this one talking about? This is talking about why the bank actually collapsed.
In 2010, right after the 2008 crash, the Obama administration signed what was known as the Dodd-Frank Act. In 2018, President Trump signed a bill that undid a lot of what Dodd-Frank had been set up to protect banks from collapsing, just like this.
In 2018, then President Trump signed a bill into law which raised the threshold at which banks would need to undergo stress tests. That number, $250 billion, SVB had just under that amount.
I think they had 249 billion. So what Trump did was he changed the laws around Dodd-Frank, and he gave them more leeway before they had to kind of bring anything into place to kind of go, hey guys, there might be a problem here. Here's a little very short clip of Donald Trump when he was president. Oh, we remember those good old days when Donald Trump was president, him talking about this.
That's why in the first 100 days, I have taken action to roll back burdensome regulations that undermine community banks, especially, I know you're going to be very disappointed at this Dodd-Frank, right? No, it's out of control. And by the way, not only for community banks, for banks, period. We can take community out of that one, right? Now, Dodd-Frank, we're working on that right now, and you'll see a very big difference because you want to get out and make our country work.
So in general, it seems like Dodd-Frank, there was like a level that banks could get into debt or have commitments to that were set at a certain level under Obama. This was brought in after the GFC in 2008. Trump came in and raised that limit. So there was a limit, which is now a higher limit. This bank was in that higher limit, right close to the threshold, and then they crashed. That seems to be the story. There's much more to this as to why they crashed, Darcy, but there's a bit of a setup for you to now pick up the baton and run and educate us all.
Sure. Yeah, and it depends on where you want to start, really. Like if we start from the regulation piece, maybe just to give a bit of a taster of why that's so relevant, is that we have an implied assumption that with regulation comes safety. And sometimes that's true. Hopefully most of the time that's true. But other times it can actually create unintended consequences, which in itself can be danger, which requires more regulation then to address. And so you have this kind of constant duct taping going on with most bits of legislation that govern how banking works, especially in the US, but also in New Zealand. There's a lot of adjustments that happen to make sure that should there be stressful events, kind of like what we're seeing right now, there's systems, policies, procedures, mechanisms in place to make sure that things kind of operate smoothly. So when you kind of take something away, the implied assumption is that you've actually just made something more dangerous and more likely to fail. And as in the case with SVG, that certainly appears to be the case, right? That because of the removal of that bit of protection, that's why this has happened. And
No,
maybe there is some truth to
I
that.
don't think. No, I don't think that's the assumption. I think the assumption is, I don't know. I haven't read anywhere where the previous limit was, but let's say it was 150 billion, not 250 billion. The reality is the warnings would have triggered earlier. That's the assumption that I take from this, and because they didn't, they got
That's right.
right to their limit, and then the official group that monitors things got in and took over. So it's not that it wouldn't have happened; it would have been easier to spot sooner on. I think that's the assumption I'm making. Tell me if I'm wrong.
Maybe. Like, I think if you really want to kind of unravel and point fingers of where this happened, like, you probably have to use your whole hand in terms of multiple things. Like, there's more than just one weak link here. One of them is something called. Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say there's also more than one person, because it's very important
yeah.
to know that yes, that happened under Donald Trump, but there were a bunch of Democrats who voted it through as well. So this is not all to be laid at the foot of Donald Trump, but this regulation change happened under the watch of Donald Trump.
Yeah. So I would say, like, one of the root causes of the issue, I believe, and I'm not saying that this is the fault of them, but it's just a situation, and you just have to recognize it for what it is, rather than saying, hey, we're going to be angry at this group of people, but it's the US Fed. And during actually, if you go back to 2008, 2009 with the global financial crisis, and then more recently with the March 2020 response, with how central banks, not just in the US, but around the world, responded to this pandemic situation. They were trying to protect us, trying to keep us safe, rightfully so. That's, hey, welcome regulators. We want to be kept safe every now and then. But unfortunately, the unintended consequence was that they created far too much money and kept interest rates far too low for far too long, which then created this inflation bubble. And I think one of the last times we spoke about you was around housing, and that was one of the serious unintended consequences of inequality and all that sort of stuff. So when you look at how it works in the banking world, you have this thing called the mismatch of maturities or duration mismatch. And what that means is it's kind of like when you're an investor, sometimes you invest in things for a long period of time to get a better rate of return. And while you're investing in those things for a long period of time to get a better rate of return, you still have short-term obligations. You still have to pay your mortgage, your food, entertainment, all that sort of stuff. If you ever run out of money, or if you have a shock in the short term, you have to then cash in your investments to be able to pay for your short-term requirements. If there's been a change in interest rates because of inflation, which is because of quantitative easing and low interest rates for too long, then now you have a problem in that your value of your long-term investments are dropping because of the rising interest rates. And it's doing it for the same reason.
Let's unpack that for the listener. So what SVB did, right, was they were quite an attractive bank while interest rates were so low, because their rates for long-term bonds was 1.8%, where other banks were in the 0.2, 0.4%. So a whole bunch of money went into SVB because their rates looked really attractive. Then interest rates go up, and all of a sudden these long-term bonds aren't looking so attractive. In fact, they're underperforming, and other banks can give more money. So what SVB does is go, we're going to sell some of these bonds at a loss to get some money in so we can do more, and then raise some more capital. And investors saw that as a problem. They're A, losing money, they're B, looking for more capital. That means this bank is failing. We're going to pull our money out. And then there was a snowball effect as to why SVB pretty much collapsed under the weight of originally those long-term bonds, then selling off bonds at a loss, then raising more capital, then spooking investors. Failure. Would that be fair? That's a pretty good synopsis.
I think so, but just important to note that it's not just SVB or Silicon Valley Bank, Silvergate, Signature as well. And I believe that this is actually just an indicator, because those are actually riskier banks, in my view, in terms of the markets they serve, crypto, startup communities, not exclusively, but a large portion of that. You're right. When interest rates were really artificially low, they had to search for yield. They had to search for rate of return, and that was found in their longer HTM, or held to maturity assets. So they piled into that. But then when interest rates go up, drops the value of the bonds. Their assets now are worth less than liabilities. And then somebody sparks it off, like Peter Thiel. And then next thing you go, everyone's freaking out because we all have access to information now, like right now. So if that happened, of course we're running the bank, right? And we're taking our money out, and that exacerbates the problem and forces the bank to realize those losses. But what I think is important for us to consider, especially when you're in a country that doesn't necessarily have those issues, is that this can be a picture of what could happen. I'm not saying it will, and in fact, there's a lot of reasons why it certainly wouldn't, especially here in New Zealand. But I'm saying that could actually be a picture of what could happen just under normal circumstances when we're in a rising interest rate environment, which,
Yeah.
as a reminder, is there to cure the inflation which was caused by central banks in the first place.
And also that kind of leans back to this argument, not that we're having this conversation today, but how much the current government, be they Labour or National, can do about these international forces causing inflation. I want to talk to you a bit about New Zealand banking, but this is more of a commentary bit, because I do kind of find it hilarious that in politics, they look for any means to criticize the other side. So these are a bunch of Republicans now, and I'm watching this from Brian Tyler Cohen's feed. He does a news show in America, an independent news show, and he's put some clips together. So credit to Brian Tyler Cohen for this, about what the right are doing in America to blame the collapse of the likes of SVB, and of course, because we're in a culture war, they're blaming wokeness for this bank falling over. Nothing to do with the Fed Reserve, nothing to do with interest rates, nothing to do with bonds. They're blaming wokeness.
See now coming out that they were one of the most woke banks in their quest for the ESG type policy, and investing. This could be a trend, and there are consequences for bad Democrat policy. And I think we need to keep an eye on all the banking sector right now.
I think that the system, I think that the administration has pushed many of these banks into more concern about global warming than they do about shareholder return. And these banks are badly run because everybody is focused on diversity and all of the woke issues and not concentrating on one thing they should, which is shareholder returns. Instead of protecting the shareholders and their employees, they're more concerned about the social policies.
So just today, Biden's top economic advisor, Cecilia Rouse, addressed reporters in the White House in the briefing room about what had just happened. And she assured everybody that the bank run we're watching is an isolated incident. No, it's not a big deal. It's just this one bank. It's not connected to anything else at all. And the fact that this bank failed, just like the fact that FTX failed, has nothing to do with the fact that the people who run it spent a ton of their time doing completely irrelevant crap that had to do with politics and changing American culture. Are you reassured by that?
That'll do. We've had enough of Tucker. So he didn't use the word woke there, but basically he's saying very clearly that they're saying it's one isolated incident, or it's isolated incident, which seems to be a theme amongst most commentators in America at the moment. The big banks seem pretty safe that this is one of the smaller banks. I mean, my mortgage is with SBS and Southern Building Society, so they're a smaller bank. Not that they're related to this at all, but what I'm saying is there are smaller banks, and there are the big boys like in New Zealand, the ANZs and the ASBs and that kind of stuff as well. But Tucker's obviously pointing towards because they're focused on politics, that's why this failed. Nothing to do with the bonds, nothing to do with whatever. Do you have any? That's more of a commentary I wanted to share with people. Do you have anything you want to share about those comments while we're here?
Yeah, the only thing is, and I've heard some pretty strong views on the left and on the right around this. What you just shared was probably middle of the road, to be honest. I've seen some pretty angry people yelling on the left and some pretty angry people yelling on the right. And then to me, it kind of just feels like a picture of a snake eating its own tail. It's actually completely irrelevant in my view. And I think when we try to approach anything in finance or wealth building, or especially the financial system, we need to recognize the fact that our morality often clouds our vision. And we often bring that bias that we have, left or right, to the scene. And it really confuses things. And yeah, maybe they've got something to say about that. Big deal. I think the core issue here, and what they're probably trying to say, those on the right, is that clearly somebody is distracted, maybe, because that is a logical conclusion, that they're distracted by something because they were not engaged in adequate risk management. The bulk of their portfolio was locked into long duration things to get yield without a clear hedging strategy. And that's the problem. And so what were they doing? Well, they weren't doing their jobs properly, that's for sure. Whatever they were doing is totally irrelevant. But I think it speaks to a bigger concern that we have, that whatever you do for wealth, whether you're into it or not, whether you own your own home and you have a mortgage or not, everything runs through the rails of the monetary system. So that's what I'm concerned about, is there a problem with the financial system? And I would say that, of course, the message is going to be everything is isolated, everything's fine, we've cleaned up the mess, there's nothing to worry about. But we always have to keep an open mind that things could get worse in an environment where there is a lot of other pieces of this puzzle that we're not talking about today that do have something to do with this.
Hey, before we leave, and we're speaking about regulation, we're speaking about banks, I want to talk about New Zealand very quickly, and I haven't set you up for this, so hopefully we can just run with it. National Party calling for a look into the regulating of banks or regulating of what's going on. But also I noticed that I think I heard Nicola Willis talk about competition, and certainly David Seymour talk about competition. And I'm pretty sure David Seymour alluded to American banks, like opening up New Zealand market to American banks for competition. So 2 questions. What do you think about the National Party's call for looking into the profits of banks and looking into the idea of regulating? I think they're being a bit wishy-washy with that, and they're kind of saying the right things to the populace without maybe necessarily, like Nicola Willis called for a short, sharp look with a narrow focus. In other words, maybe they don't want to find too much because it's narrow. That's the first thing I want to ask you about the idea of looking into regulations. And the second thing is about, what do you think about opening up our market to international banks to, as ACT would say, provide competition to help the consumer? I guess looking at it from a capitalistic point of view. Your thoughts on those 2 things?
Yeah, well, I think, like, if we're talking about what's coming out of Labor Light, I think is what some would call them, is that the regulation. And forgive me, I'm not super into politics, apart from the fact that I hate them all. Any help that they need, any help that they say they're going to bring to the table in terms of looking at banks and their profits and all that sort of stuff, in my view, is kind of like lip service. There needs to be a very serious independent investigation conducted at a much higher level, i.e. the Central Bank of New Zealand, the Reserve Bank of New Zealand, because that is very interesting. What happened in March 2020 is they didn't necessarily look at what was happening on the ground. They took their run sheet from what was happening overseas with the Fed. And I think that's probably what led to a lot of the problems that we have here. And so I think the review is important. The profitability, yeah, that's insane. But we have to look at both sides of all of those things, because we don't want a situation where our banks are weak. We don't want a situation where they do leave. And I know that they're using that as threats every now and then, that they're going to leave, go to Australia and just leave us in the lurch here. We do need a banking service, because that's the rails. They provide the infrastructure for our wealth. So we kind of, like it or lump it, we have to deal with it. As to opening up, I guess the question I would bring to that is, why is it currently closed up? Why are banks currently closed up? What are they afraid of in terms of open banking, for example? Why are new challenger banks disincentivized to coming here? Why is there a focus on, I guess, consolidation and focusing on the big players and making that safer for us? And I think that's probably more concerning, especially in a small market like New Zealand. We need to have a lot of small regional banks like SBS and a few others. But if it's harder for them to play the game, that's going to be problematic. But I don't think there's an easy solution to that. Just like I don't think there's an easy solution to anything. I wish there was. But I think neobanks and I think decentralized finance are the 2 things that we should be looking to, rather than reform on the traditional banking sector.
Right.
Because like with any creative destruction, you have to look at the new more than you look at the old.
Last little idea is, we were talking about this in the BHN earlier in the week, is one way that, like we talk about a capitalistic system and the cream rising to the top and user pays, and the public will decide. Why doesn't the public just get all their money into TSB, Kiwi Bank, SBS, Cooperative Bank, these banks that are actually keeping their profits in New Zealand, and then problem solved, isn't it? If it was $6 billion worth of profits for New Zealand banks in New Zealand, isn't that, I mean, it's still profits, got it, yes, but isn't that one of the big concerns, that we, the consumer, could probably drive change in this market as well, if we all moved away from those Australian-owned banks?
Yeah, that's an interesting concept. I haven't really thought about that much. And I don't know enough about banking at that level to actually probably comment on that very much. But I guess you're right. Like, if we as individuals, that's why I'm quite into decentralized pots of power rather than a lot of centralization. If we as individuals exercise our own free will with our own assets and resource and put it to where we feel safest, then the free market decides. So it sounds like you're a free market participant after all, eh?
I've never claimed one or the other. I think that any ism, right? Any ism, whether it's capitalism or socialism or Buddhism or any of those isms, at their core have a lot of value to them. I feel that we as the species that we are innately corrupt. We're corrupted by things around us, and it's not the ism that's the issue. It's how people use that ism. Most of those isms are pretty amoral. It's human beings that are either moral or immoral within them. So I would say to you that would be my answer for any of those kind of titles. That it's the people who make them work or don't. I was talking to someone today. I won't even say what he's worth, but it's hundreds of millions of dollars, and he's spanned his business nous and gravitas into a way of supporting the environment and giving funding to groups who are doing good work. And it's conscious capitalism. So it's the people involved with the isms rather than the isms themselves. That's how I kind of deal with it, Darcy.
Yeah, well said. No, that's good. I think, but yeah, individuals with their own resource exercising free will can actually solve a lot of these problems, in my view.
Yeah.
And so I think it's probably more like a centralization rather than an ism, but centralization versus decentralization. And if we're thinking about change in terms of what regulation is needed, needs to be changed, whatever the story is, or banks need to open up, individuals will probably bring that in rather than big corporates and government working together, in my view.
I think it's called centralization-ism. I think that's what you say, Darcy.
Oh, let's go with that one. Let's go with that one.
How do people find out about Everyday Investor? Where can they get it? All your normal places for podcasts and stuff?
Correct. All the normal places. YouTube, just Google me on the Google. I haven't tried ChatGPT to see if it knows who I am yet. That would be interesting. But yeah, definitely I'm out there.
All right, Darcy Ungaro, New Zealand Everyday Investor. Thanks for joining us, man. I've really enjoyed it, and it has been too long, and we'll do this again super soon.
Sounds awesome. Thanks very much, Pat.
Cool bananas. And I'm glad to see you guys are all taking that so freaking seriously, debating Darcy's picture in the background. Well done. For people who are watching later on, anyone else think Darcy's picture on the wall needs straightening? I think it's upside down. Could be, Brenda. Darcy's wall has me all OCD. Darcy's picture is hung precisely as the artist's signature right-hand base intended, and it's obviously working. I'll tell you something funny. When we started that conversation this afternoon, Darcy said, "Oh, I'm looking a bit messy in the background. I think I'll just blur my background." And he blurred it, and I went, "Okay." He went, "What do you think?" And I went, "No, you do whatever you want. I prefer the background showing, but if you want to blur it, that's all good." And he went, "Oh, no, I'll show it." And he put his background on. So that debate goes on, Picturegate, we can call it, #Picturegate. You can thank me for asking Darcy to leave the image up or suggesting that it looked better with it being up. Speaking of the banks, conversation from earlier. Good evening, everybody, says Simon from earlier today. Everybody, banks collecting is like 2008 all over again. I had some other conversations about the earlier chat. Lineker is a national hero, and his fellow pundits go back to his England days. Lineker is legit, and his refugee stuff, he has refugees living in his house. On the banks, this is about Trump. He also removed the needs for these banks to hold cash reserves. The Silicon Valley Bank, regulated as a bank, but operated a rather risky investment fund. And Carl says, LOL, since when are banks more concerned with D&I over shareholder value? The woke mind and virus is alive, living in Republican heads. Yeah, and look, this is the last part of the conversation for today. We're going to go on to a chat about the idea of what is woke. Now, we'll move straight into it, and I'm sure some of you have seen this because it's sort of doing the rounds today. There is a program called Rising. Rising is an internet-based show. It's on the Hill. It is a corporate sort of a show, but it has a little bit more freedom to chat about this, that, and the other. And the hosts kind of produce it themselves, even though it's belonged to it. It'd be like the New Zealand Herald doing a daily news show like this. So it's independent in thought, but sort of mainstream media in backing, if that makes sense. There was a question asked to a guest who had come on, written a book about, the book wasn't necessarily about the woke left, but it kind of incorporated a bunch of that. And the question was asked of this guest about the war of right versus left. Now, This is the guest in the middle. She'll answer the question to start with. I'm not going to include the question, but it's the next part of the question where I think it's Brianna Joy Gray, something like that, then asks the guest about the idea of what it means to be woke. And this is how we're going to wrap up the show. So the banks are woke. All right. Everyone on the left is woke. What does it actually mean to be woke? That's how we're going to wrap up the show. And I have a definitive answer for you, by the way. Okay, that's actually the wrong place. Let me find where my thing is. 6 minutes 12. I forgot to re-queue it back up. I'll go to 6 minutes 12. And there we go. That'll do. 6 minutes 10. Here we go. Okay, I see you. I see you, people. Nothing's changed in my setup. So how can there be no sound? Goodness gracious me. I apologize. I'm going to have to go and reset something, which it shouldn't be the case, but we need to hear this. So talk amongst yourselves for a minute while I actually have to get out of here. This is the same screen we were using to watch the commentary before, so something very bizarre has happened in between. I'm going to stop the screen. I'm going to reshare the screen, and I'm going to click that. Now, you need to tell me very quickly if you can hear this and if there's an echo, because if the system's playing an echo, I will stop it and do something else. If the system is playing the sound correctly, tell me in the chat and I will go on. Here we go.
And so in this circumstance, there's a lot of things that are sort of a right versus left conversation, but this is not one of them. And I agree with you. I think that there are a lot of people for whom this argument resonates, and it's not just right-left issue. We hope that, you know, parents of all political stripes will pick up the book. This is sort of a woke reimagining that is very, very, very far left. Only 7% of Americans consider themselves very liberal, and probably fewer of them consider themselves to be woke. And so, you know, when we talk about traditional
what does that mean to you? Would you mind defining woke? Because it's come up a couple times, and I just want to make sure we're on the same page.
So, I mean, woke is sort of the idea that this is going to be one of those moments that goes viral. I mean, woke is something that's very hard to define, and we've spent an entire chapter defining it. It is sort of the understanding.
Did you get that? In her book, she spends a whole entire chapter defining woke, yet she can't come up with a definition of what is woke.
This is going to be one of those moments that goes viral. I mean, woke is something that's very hard to define, and we've spent an entire chapter defining it. It is sort of the understanding that we need to totally reimagine and redo society in order to create hierarchies of oppression. Sorry, it's hard to explain in a 15-second soundbite.
Yeah, look, I
mean, it's one of those.
There was a brilliant bit there. The male host was over speaking, Brianna Joy Gray. When the guest says it's hard to describe in 15 seconds, Brianna Joy Gray says, you can take your time. Have a listen again.
Redo society in order to create hierarchies of oppression. It's hard to explain in a 15-second soundbite.
Yeah, look, I mean, it's one of those things that.
And then basically so this is a bit in America. This is a bit like they have a left-wing commentator, a right-wing commentator, and they do a daily show together. And the right-wing commentator jumps in to try and save the guest and goes on and talks about some kind of definition and talks about pronouns and talks about this. But the person who's there, the guest who's there, who was there because she's written a book of which there is a whole chapter, as she has just said. I'm just going to try and find, there's probably there. So the author of Stolen Youth couldn't actually describe what it is. So what I thought I'd do is I'd probably, and I may have showed you this once before, I'd go to our mate our mate Karen, because I had this conversation with Karen on one of my podcasts, and I wanted to know from Karen, who uses the word woke every single sentence. Like, I think it's in his contract that every single sentence he has to use the word woke, what it actually means. And I asked him the same question, and this is what he had to say. Tell me someone, give me an example of someone who's not woke then. Because it seems to me that, I'm not saying you've said this, that if you wanted to, you could find an
I don't
attribute
think
or a
Michael Laws
character-
is woke. Michael Laws certainly isn't woke. Who else isn't woke? I don't think I'm particularly woke. I don't think Mike Hoskins is woke. I don't think Simon, if we talk about media people, I don't think Simon Dallow is woke.
Well, Simon Dellow's nothing. He's neither, because he don't. I don't mean nothing in a bad way. I love Simon. I've worked with him, but he doesn't give an opinion.
He's a perfect newsreader. He's
Yeah.
neutral. So apparently he doesn't talk lezzy.
I don't know what that
He was
means.
once asked if he saw his ex-wife, Alison Moore, if they bumped into each other or he bumped into her with her girlfriend at the kids' weekend sport. And he was quoted somewhere saying, I don't talk to them. I don't speak lezzy.
Oh, okay.
Which is interesting. But, and he'd never put him, her in his pronouns. Who else isn't woke? I think there aren't many woke people in the National Caucus. There aren't many woke people in my office or on my broadcast team. But okay, look, it is a term that I do not tend to apply unless there is a specific story to anyone specific. But I like it as a term because we're talking about it and we're engaged and we're talking about the culture war. So in some ways, it is a means
stupidest
to an end.
argument in the world.
But I'm okay with the
I
word
like
woke
it
because
it means we can talk
Barack
about the word
Obama
that I
is
like.
happy to use it, and Barack Obama has used it in the context of people who sit there active on social media or who virtue signal. That's the other part of wokeness, and go around saying, look at what I've done. Look at how cool and with it I am. Look at how tolerant I am. Look at how diverse I am.
Sean, you're an incredibly intelligent, gifted broadcaster and smart man and good businessman. But to be fair, to say that I'm okay with word X because person Y uses it is such a nonsense reason behind it. So are you okay with the N word? Are you going to use that because lots of high profile people use the N word? So basically, you're going to be blasting that. I think it's okay to use.
And this isn't being woke. I think it is a word that has absolutely negative and terrible connotations. I know that
woke to me.
Certain ethnicities use it. I wouldn't use the C word in polite company. You know, communist.
So you're moderating yourself.
I self-moderate, but I don't go around telling people that I wouldn't use the N word.
But one of the things you were saying about Seymour before was his self-moderation seemed to be a bit of a, he's not as good as he's, but you're self-moderating yourself there, Sean, on some level.
Oh, I'm trying, but also I don't want to moderate often. I want to engage people and outrage people.
Now that we've expanded this conversation around woke, I feel like probably, as per your definition, 99% of the community is woke now compared to the other, because they probably think it feels a little bit like what you're saying is, if you disagree,
it's a movable feast. It's a movable feast.
If you disagree with my perspective, exactly,
you're woke.
Then
you're
somewhat
actually
woke.
That's probably the best definition we can come up with. That if I disagree with you, you're woke. I like that.
Shakespeare said, just as off-proof prophets, we often use the colloquial version of many a truth be told in jest. I like JK. Sorry about that, JK. Because that is precisely what it means to many people. If I don't like what you're saying, then you're woke. It's ironic how the right often talk about the left shutting down conversations by using terms like, you're a racist or you're a Nazi or whatever. It's exactly what they do with the word woke. Like I've said it before, come at me with the ideas and the opinions that I have, but people who typically go, well, you're on the left. That's not an argument. That's not a debatable point, right? It's like, debate the point, debate the piece of information we've give out there, negate that. You don't negate a conversation by saying, oh, you belong to that group, so you must be wrong. And I honestly and truly believe that whilst at the end of that interaction with Karen, there was a bit of mirth and stuff going on and a bit of kind of pushback about wink, wink, nudge, nudge from Karen. That's because that's what he believes. He believes if you disagree with his middle-class, boomer, male, white position, then you're woke. And that's it. did you notice all the people he was listing off that weren't woke? Same age, same race, same sex, pretty much. Now, I said to you, I had an answer for you as well. 2 weeks ago on Last Week Tonight, John Oliver did a piece on Ron DeSantis. And John Oliver actually found some information from Ron DeSantis. And one of the things he found was at one point Ron DeSantis was in court and his counsel was asked to define what the word woke meant. So this is Ron DeSantis, who, much like many on the right, Karen included, uses woke every third word. His counsel, his representative, was asked to define what woke was. So we actually have an answer for what woke is, as has been suggested and taken into record in a court of law, right? Here's the setup to the piece.
Florida is where woke goes to die.
DeSantis says woke so often it begins to lose all meaning. But if you wonder what he thinks it actually stands for, his general counsel once helpfully defined woke in court as the view that there are systemic injustices in American society and the need to have policies that address them.
So, according to Ron DeSantis's team, woke means a view that there are systemic injustices in American society and the need to have policies that address them. That sounds like a fairly appropriate thing to have a view on. And I think, like one of the commentators has said here, Simon, that originally woke originated as an African-American slang for enlightened, from my understanding. Yes, enlightened, that there are systemic injustices in American society and that they need to have policies to address them. So if you want any more evidence in the world ever that especially the right in America, but obviously it flows through to New Zealand, just use the word woke that doesn't to mean you disagree with me, then simply have a look how the right in America, when they're forced to describe it as a way to look at injustices in the world. And that's what it means. Carl says, this coming from the side who blasts academics that they can't define the word woman is hilarious. That's about not being able to define what woke is. Paul says woke is bloody political correctness gone mad. And Kooky has come in saying he's tardy, so he's chosen himself to pay himself a late fee of $2.20 as a super chat. So thanks, Kooky, for your super chat there. We appreciate it. And that's pretty much, there it is right there. Woke is a term used by people that debate rather than communicate. Well, I don't think necessarily it's that debate rather than communicate. It's probably that want to stop debate. You know, it is very funny how as has been identified, so many people in the world of the, why aren't you going away? There we go. In the world of tell me what this word means. Tell me what this word means. What does this word mean? Tell me what this word means. No, it doesn't mean that. This is what it means. Are also the same people that can't define the word woke, that use it. So all these people who want to nail us down, nail you down, nail me down, and try and score points based around definitions of words, can't actually define some of the words they use most of all as well, which is kind of pretty hilarious in my book. All right, team. I see Chewy's out of as people were asking where's Chewy, and maybe he was okay, like sick or something. He was doing some, I think, judging, certainly some panel work, some work for the Dunedin Fringe Festival, I think, around the comedy scene. So that's where he is tonight, and he's doing a few of those next week as well. The Dunedin Fringe is on at the moment. So that's where Chewy was tonight, but hopefully you enjoyed our two guests. And as we wrap up the show, a big thanks to our patrons. Thank you so much for being involved. If you want to be involved with what we're doing, very easy to do that. Head to patreon.com/big hairy news. And I think that we are pretty much done for the week. It is Thursday, isn't it? Is it Thursday? I think it's Thursday. Yeah, it's Thursday. Now, let me say as well, for those of you guys who have been enjoying the Friday night long form conversations in the DOC, we don't have one for tomorrow night. So there's nothing for tomorrow night. There was a couple of people that were supposed to come back to me who didn't get back to me, and it's been a busy week. So there's no long form conversation tomorrow night, which means I will... tomorrow night, you should go and listen to one of the Let's Talk Funny podcasts. Michelle A. caught this week. Just look up Let's Talk Funny on the or go to the DOC Facebook, YouTube channel and watch Michelle tomorrow night at 9 o'clock. That would be good. All right, I think that we should wrap up for the night, wrap up for the weekend, and we'll catch you again on Monday night for another edition. Thank you for joining us. Really have appreciated you guys. All the best. Be safe through the weekend. We want to see every single one of you back here on Monday night for another edition of Big Hairy News. And that's us. We're out. And go and watch Ted Lasso over the weekend. Ted Lasso. Go and watch Ted Lasso over the weekend, because as soon as Chewie comes back, we're going to be talking about it. And I think episodes get released on a Wednesday. So by next Wednesday, we'll probably be talking about the second episode. All right, team. All the best. Take care. We will catch you on Monday night. Oh, no, actually, I'm wrong. I think Monday night's a public holiday. I don't know what it is, but my kid told me today that we've got a long weekend. So it might be Tuesday night. But I'll let you know. Follow me on Twitter. I'll let you know. If Monday is a public, then I'm going to have other things to do. If it's not, we'll see you Monday night and we'll see you Tuesday. And other than that, we're done. All the best. We'll catch you next week. Come back. See you then. Hooroo.